Very warm welcome to this webinar, which is organised under the umbrella of the Issue-Based Coalition on Environment and Climate Change. The coalition is one of the results of the UN Development System reform. And this particular issue-based coalition brings together 18 agencies, funds and programs within the region. My name is Nick Bonvoisen from UNECE. I'm part of a core team of this coalition, and I'm joined by a couple of UNECE colleagues, Angela, who will be presenting a bit later, and Costanza, our intern, who will be taking some notes. So at the beginning of this year, DCO issued a questionnaire to country teams and resident coordinators. And as a result, there was a request from the UNICEF team in Turkmenistan for this particular webinar. It's the second that we have delivered. We also provided one for Georgia on the nexus of climate action and leaving no one behind. So we're very fortunate that we have a nice group of speakers today. So these are people who have volunteered from within the coalition to talk about the topics that we've been asked to address. And I hope it will be useful. And if it may not, I'm sure it will not answer all questions, but I hope that it can provide an opening for further contacts and further strengthening in this particular area. So I would like to pass over to Adrian Sullivan, who is UNICEF Acting Deputy Representative in Turkmenistan. So over to you, Adrian.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much.
You're quite quiet, by the way. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to have to, is this better?
Yes, perfect.
Can you hear me okay now? Okay, fantastic. I think I have a bit of a problem with my microphone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to meet you all and to be present here today. I think it's an absolutely critical topic. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. And without further ado, one second. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So in Turkmenistan, just to give colleagues a little bit of background, the country ratified the Paris Agreement back in 2016 and has been very strongly encouraging the adoption of the SDGs across the board, including SDG 12 and number 13. And they have been very strong in their commitments to implement the environmental considerations, and they've undertaken a lot of projects. It goes from looking at pollution, looking at infrastructure. They've invested in infrastructure everywhere. But one of the things that we identified is that when it came to learning and teaching on climate change and adaptation, there was very little resources, there were very little skills, knowledge, and they didn't have curriculum or how to teach the issues on climate change adaptation. And so UNICEF saw the opportunity to contribute and help the country implement their obligations to reach climate change and environmental issues through the Ministry of Education by incorporating curriculum into primary and secondary education. And I just want to give a shout out to Valeria, who is our colleague in the office, who has really carried this work forward. I'm presenting it, but this is really her work on this. What you see in front of you is a number of manuals that were produced. It's a mix of actual curriculums, which teaches children about climate change. It's in a very interactive way. It incorporates play and challenges, but equally the teaching manuals for the teachers to learn them, to teach them how to teach the curriculum. This was work that was, I think, completed in January 2023, and it resulted in something like 14,500 copies of both the methodological manuals and the curriculum being shared to all schools. So we're talking about 2 million children across the country and aged from 6 to 17. And so these manuals were developed to help bring about the strength in school children. Of course, the earlier we are able to incorporate climate change issues and knowledge in young children, the benefits can only increase over time. So what this has identified for us is that through UNICEF's Leaving No Child Behind approach to all its programming, there are issues with disability, because currently, as we stand, able children are able to get access to the information, but we are having an issue with regards to reaching out to children with disabilities. So on one hand, there are children who are deaf, who even if you read the book to, they're not going to be able to hear what you say. So we definitely need to have these teaching manuals adapted into a sort of a braille, with a sort of braille approach. But that means also that braille is not very well known in Turkmenistan. So the building block goes back even further, where we have to introduce somehow the ability to read books that are adapted to deaf people. And then there's the blind. So those who can't see very well, we need to develop climate change adaptation for these two groups of children. And that requires quite a huge amount of work on capacity building. So this is going to be the next phase of that work. To address that, we have a number of challenges. And of course, the number one is expertise. We have clearly seen excellent will. We have seen good engagement. There is definitely an interest in Turkmenistan to address these issues. I mean, but there isn't a lot of knowledge and expertise. I mean, just to share with you one element of Turkmenistan society is that every month the water bill that communities pay for their water, which is about $10. So a lot of the resources households use, which in many developing countries are, there's a lot of pressure on them, use of water, use of electricity, there's energy saving devices. In Turkmenistan, these are heavily subsidized. So there isn't the pressure in the household to adapt and adopt cost saving measures on use of resources and water, which is a problem, because it's a country surrounded by deserts. The water is imported mainly from neighboring countries through canals, and so resources are limited in country, but it doesn't match with very often the way these are managed in country. So there's a lot of capacity building aspects to address. There's need for a lot of technical support, not only in the materials, but also in the knowledge and the training. And ultimately, there is a need for funding. So this is the knowledge, how we are addressing the knowledge aspects in Turkmenistan. But one of the other aspects that we're dealing with is how to take the knowledge that is being developed and shared with communities and how to incorporate it into the lives of children. And that's where we come with the Green School approach. So it's a program that's going to be signed, and we're hopefully going to be implementing it as of the autumn 2023 onwards. And what this means is that we're going to try to incorporate climate adaptation into the schools so that children can not only learn about it, but they can also live it. So this takes a classic approach to, for example, putting in solar panels into the schools so that they become more energy efficient. We look at the learning environment so that we can adapt that to the environment in which they work in. It's going to be looking at water. It's going to be looking at greening the environment around them with plants, and so that when they learn about the aspects of greening, they can also have it within their schools as well. And that's going to look at water as well, waste management. There's going to be a number of aspects to do that, because we need to have it sustainably incorporated into the schools, and hopefully as they go through their education and their academic years, we're going to have that carried on through into older generations. So that's going to be one of the aspects we're going to deal with. So here you have an example of a green school in Bali. Of course, this looks it's very ideal. Turkmenistan is not Bali, and we're not going to have a school like this, but this goes to show you what kind of ideas are being implemented in other countries. We are looking more at this type of school, because this is probably more about the types of schools you're seeing in the districts and the regions of Turkmenistan. I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to try to build the resilience of students in climate change and the impact through an interactive approach using both the teachers and the children. There is an opportunity for digital technology. So when we think about addressing the needs of children with disabilities, there are quite a number of innovations on the market, especially when we look at text to speech, which can help with children who are who are not going to be able to see the books, but there's going to be other opportunities as well, looking at what digital technology exists to be able to adapt it to giving access to children with disability. There's a lot of need to upgrade the skills of teachers. They definitely are keen to learn, but they need the support and guidance in order to get there. The access to resources in Turkmenistan is also very limited. So we have a curriculum here, but there also needs to be access to the wider body of knowledge, because it's changing all the time and our knowledge is only increasing over time. The current curriculum now is addressing primary schools and secondary schools, but it's going to have to go into a higher level of education as well. This also contributes to the national level of growth and understanding. In terms of the program objectives that we have in terms of the green schools, it is not only to improve the infrastructure, but it's also to improve and apply innovative solutions and digital approaches to it. Some ideas that are going to be applied is open air training sessions to ensure that environment becomes a little bit more surrounding the child as they learn about it. We're going to be promoting the reduction of greenhouse effects, carbon footprints, reduction of carbon dioxide emissions, as well as encourage a reduction of waste production and reducing use of single plastic materials. Many of these aspects are not very well developed in Turkmenistan, so this is going to be one of the areas we're going to try and increase that awareness by having a more environmentally responsible approach to their lives. The Green School is a prototype model, so this is going to be applied in only one or two areas. There's going to be a further incorporation of climate change into the wider educational system in Turkmenistan, and one of the best ways to do that is by introducing contests and some competition to see which group of children could come up with friendly projects amongst them. And we're going to try to teach also a training course on journalism. Environmental issues are not very well reported on in Turkmenistan. So this could also be an opportunity to increase that by raising awareness through the media. And ultimately, it's going to establish a faculty of ecological journalism in the Turkmen State University. The challenges we have is, as I mentioned before, there is lack of technical expertise in the country. There's a lack of understanding of how to green areas. I mean, if you look at food management, food waste, sourcing ecological foods, environmentally sourced foods, that's not very well seen in Turkmenistan. We have a number of pilot examples where we are solarizing social services. So we've put solar panels on health facilities, but it's not really well embedded yet outside of Ashgabat into the rural areas. So there needs to be some support to help encourage the adoption of new technology. Capacity of local partners is a key area. Of course, the main partner that we go through is through the government, but we have partners such as the Red Crescent Society, which is very active and mobilized in communities. So transferring knowledge into other partners, especially community-based organizations, would be extremely helpful to partner with others. And to help with consultancies to help to take this to take this forward. But ultimately, the key area that is an issue for many programs in Turkmenistan is the mobilization of funding, because that underpins everything. As it's a middle-income country, funding is always a challenge, opportunity is always a challenge, and competition is stiff. So we look forward to support and advice and guidance on the above. Thank you very much. I hope I wasn't over time.
Very many thanks, Adrian. Impressive basis. So I would invite Therese to now talk to us from the perspective of OHCHR, and invite you. I think you're going to share your screen as well. Yeah.
That's my plan.
Thank you, Therese.
Nick, let me see if you can see this properly. I'd appreciate if you just confirm that it's you can see it properly. Great, thank you so much, and really a big thanks for inviting OHCHR today. My presentation is a little bit more broadly focused on the entry points for the work of our office and the human rights-based approach to disability-inclusive climate action. I'll definitely be touching upon education as well, so I hope that this may be useful. Just in terms of the entry points, obviously for our office, climate change being a threat to human rights, including the right to education, to work, and many others, that is really disproportionately impacting persons in vulnerable situations. That's sort of the main entry point for us. And I have a 5-year-old here, speaking of right to education. Swiss schools are closed on Wednesdays, so I apologize if I have a second presenter here by my side at times. For us, obviously under international human rights law, states have an obligation to prevent these foreseeable impacts of climate change on, in particular, in persons in vulnerable situations, including persons with disabilities, and that's really our entry point to this work. and to us, that human rights-based approach is really all about identifying rights holders and entitlements, duty bearers, clarifying their obligations, and embedding really all of this in climate action. What I wanted to mention to you at the outset, really, our work on climate change and human rights has been mandated by a resolution at the Human Rights Council. The group of states who are putting this forward on an annual basis is Vietnam, Philippines, and Bangladesh. And back in 2019, that resolution, which has been looking at different groups in vulnerable situations, including children, migrants, older persons, asked us to do dedicated work on climate change and the intersections of those impacts on the rights of persons with disabilities. And there's a couple of just key points that really stand out very clearly from that work that we undertook. First of all, obviously, almost 15% of the global population is living with a disability. And another sort of common trait for this is that the majority of these people are living in poverty. So when we talk about adverse impacts really hitting persons with disability hard, that is because of a variety of factors. And we really stress that, many of these are constructs, social, economic, cultural constructs. Stigmatization and stigma really play a role here as well in excluding people from accessing also means that could build the resilience and so on and so forth. So that's really been an important entry point for us. Obviously, outlining the impacts, I think this is very, very clear to everyone. We're talking about health, housing, water and sanitation, and really how climate change is just adding to a range of challenges and barriers, constructed barriers that persons with disabilities already face. Sorry about that. And that obviously includes, access to education, as well as to work, to employment, where we see that persons with disabilities are much more likely to be unemployed due to a variety of factors. And this, again, just being really exacerbated by climate change. Food security is another important component that goes hand in hand with this. And then, of course, when we talk about mobility, when we talk both about slow and sudden onset events, how also resettlement options are limited for persons with disabilities. And just to move more onto the practical side, which is what we're talking about today, how do we go about and address that? Obviously, again, related to education and the need for information. The images that I'm using for this presentation, I've taken this from the accessible versions that we've produced of these reports that we were mandated to do by the Human Rights Council. So these are from the easy to read reports, which is one of the measures that has been put in place through this resolution, where the core group of states has asked us to make the typical not so accessible Human Rights Council resolutions, which I believe is not necessarily read in its original form by an awful lot of people. Breaking this information down into accessible formats is part of what we're doing at our office. Obviously, improving access to schools, meeting venues, workplaces is key, and then really inclusive planning so that persons with disabilities and their requirements are included at the outset. Finally, again, as we mentioned, really equal opportunities is key here. Addressing these barriers, both to education and to the labor market, and which is partially based on discriminatory both practice and attitudes, is really key. And then the need for better data collection and analysis is something that we see in many of the countries in which we work. I wanted to take this opportunity to present a project so I'm working in the environment team of the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva, and our colleagues who are dedicatedly working on disability rights has developed this. Sorry about that. It's my 5-year-old helping us with the presentation that colleagues working on disability rights have produced in a series of work that is really looking at the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and climate change, just to bring in this disaster risk reduction perspective that was also part of what we're discussing today, has developed this guide for SDGs and how they can be inclusive. And I'd be really happy to share the link to this publication afterwards, because it has some interesting points also on education. But basically, it's quite a practical guide who also sets out very clear do's and don'ts, which I think is sort of interesting, because sometimes when you read the don'ts about what you shouldn't do, they're so obvious, and still, the challenges that some of these practices are still being implemented. So that's part of what I wanted to mention to you today. Just to round off, to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing on the ground with partners. We will be starting to implement this year a project jointly with UNDP and ILO in Jordan and South Africa and Somalia, where we'll be looking at disability inclusion and addressing intersectional forms of discrimination. So also broader than disability, also looking at, in particular, the inclusion of youth, for example, and of women in climate legislation and laws. So both in and nationally determined contributions, as well as in national adaptation plans. So that's something we'd be really happy to share more with you about later. And then finally, OHCHR is also really happy to be part of a working group on disability inclusive climate action, which is jointly led by the World Bank, colleagues in the ILO, and with this mixed membership, which is both member states and civil society organizations. I'll stop here. I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm ready for questions and answers, and I really need to apologize again for this multiple members that are intervening with this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese, and thank you for the team effort in the presentation. First of all, to let you know that Valeria Danilichenko has asked for a link to the documents you shared at the end. And maybe you could put that in the chat. And I don't know if there are any questions. Please do either put them in the chat or raise your hand, or even just speak up if you wish. But that was a very nice introduction. Thank you, Therese. If not, we can catch back up with our timetable and move on to UNDRR, where Milos Gubic will be talking about expertise to develop adapted disability inclusive climate change adaptation and DRR materials. So over to you, Milos. Milos, excuse me.
Milos, it's Milos, yes. Thanks. Good morning, good afternoon to all. Greetings from Brussels. My name is Milos Gubic. I work for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. The abbreviation is UNDRR. Within the UN system, we are the focal point agency for coordination of disaster risk reduction. I'm working for the Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia. We are based in Brussels, and we cover 55 countries in our region, so Europe, South Caucasus, and Central Asia. And we support the member states in the implementation of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today and support our joint efforts in this noble mission of making our disaster risk reduction and climate change work and policies more disability inclusive. So if you allow, I would just share my screen. Nicholas, would you just let me know if you can see it full screen or no?
It's perfect, full screen.
It's full screen, then great, I can continue. So yes, over the next 10 minutes, let me just see what time is it. I will just say a few words on disability inclusive implementation of Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So I'm aware that I'm talking to the UN audience, so will not be talking too much about the Sendai framework, but just in a very few words, Sendai framework was adopted in 2000 and endorsed in 2015 for the period of 15 years until 2030. It's part of the Global Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. It goes hand in hand with other development frameworks, including the New Urban Agenda, Paris Agreement, and so on. The Sendai framework focuses on adoptions of measures that can help us to reduce the current risks, but also to prevent new and future risks. It also outlines 4 main priorities and 7 global targets that we need to reach in order to ensure that our communities in the world is resilient to disasters. You can see it on the right side of the screen. So the targets are reducing the disaster mortality, reducing the number of affected people, economic losses and damages to infrastructures, while increasing the number of DRR strategies that we have at national and local level, also international cooperation and early warning system for all. When it comes to Sendai framework and disability inclusion, I would like to mention that Sendai framework recognizes the importance of disability inclusion in all aspects of disaster risk reduction, and calls member states to include persons with disabilities in their respective organizations in their DRR efforts at national and local level. Also, Sendai framework emphasized that disability community, they have their specific needs that need to be acknowledged, but also recognize that this community has their own knowledge, skills, resources that can be of use and that can help us to build resilient communities. And also, Sendai framework recognize disability community as a strong partner in this process rather than a vulnerable group. As I mentioned, Sendai framework was adopted for a period from 2015 to 2030, and we are now in the midpoint of its implementation. And last month in May in New York, there was a high-level meeting and a midterm review of the Sendai framework that took stock of what has been achieved and which tells us where do we stand at the moment. So the findings of the midterm review tells us that there is some process, but we are still not on the track to realize and implement the Sendai framework by 2030. The finding reveals that, for instance, the number of persons affected by disaster has increased since 2015, which is also mainly due to COVID. Also, a majority of the development assistance globally goes to recovery and response, and only 4% goes to prevention. And definitely we need a more balanced approach and better focus on prevention as well. Also, we have seen progress in the number of disaster risk reduction strategies at the national level. However, local level does not follow this, and more work is needed in this aspect as well. What also it tells us that, for instance, disaster data that we collect, there is some progress in disaggregating data by sex and age. However, disaggregating it by disability remains quite weak and insufficient. When it comes to persons with disabilities and Sendai framework, we asked disability community within our stakeholder engagement mechanism to help us to do a review to see where we are standing at the moment. And the findings reveal that even though there are some efforts towards disability inclusive disaster risk reduction that have been reported, establishment and implementation of inclusive DRR systems are still limited. Also, we know that there is an increase in some supportive policies and legislations. However, implementation of those policies is quite slow, and mostly it comes from non-state actors, which means that it's mainly project-based, and obviously there are some concerns about the sustainability. Also, in all these policies, the rights approach is a bit missing, and a reference to persons with disabilities as vulnerable group is still very dominant. Also, one of the main reasons for disproportionate impact of disasters to this community is social exclusion, lack of accessible infrastructure, and early warning system that is not reaching them. And finally, we were also able to understand that persons with psychological disabilities are particularly forgotten, particularly those that live in institutions. So finally, what is the way forward and how we can accelerate disability inclusive implementation of the framework? Firstly, we need to better understand disaster risks and how disaster impact this particular stakeholder group. So I already mentioned that there are some gaps in data collection and disaggregation. So what is really needed and important that persons with disabilities and their respective organizations are well involved in data collection and analysis of data. Also, we need to ensure that data is collected and disaggregated systematically within the broader DRR systems that we have in place in the countries. And finally, we need to improve the use of those disaggregated data to increase our knowledge about disaster risks, improve reporting, and measure the impact. Also, persons with disabilities, we all know, experience adverse impact of disasters, and this needs to be acknowledged and taken into consideration for the risk assessment. So what is recommended is that we need to strengthen the understanding of new and future risks on persons with disabilities, and they need to be involved from the very early stage and risk assessment. Also, all disability all risk assessment and relevant risk information needs to be available in accessible and easily understandable format for the community. And also this disability inclusion needs to be taken into account when we kind of create a culture of prevention that is much needed, whether through school curricula or any other way we do it. Also, what is important is to have meaningful participation of these communities in DRR processes, which means that if governments wants to implement the Sendai framework, they need to create a space or a platform where this stakeholder group would be listened to and would be able to contribute to discussions and decision-making process. Also, I was recently in last month in Romania, attending a disability inclusive DRR event that they had there. So there was a disability community, there was also civil protection and national government, and the result was that now the civil protection and the government within the National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, they created a specific working group with disability community, which will try to take this agenda forward in the country, which is really good. So those kind of partnerships within this community and governments is really recommended. Finally, something that is really important is obviously investing in DRR. So we already know what I mentioned at the beginning, that very little money goes on prevention. The majority of the money goes for a recovery and response. So even out of that little money that we have dedicated to prevention, even less money goes on disability inclusive DRR, and definitely we need a more balanced approach towards that. So we need to have dedicated budget and resources for disability inclusive DRR. We need to have allocated budget for reasonable accommodation that would enable participation of these communities in all the processes. Also, we need to have allocated budget for assistive technology and devices that can be really important for risk communication. And finally, we need to track spending on disability inclusive DRR, which can help us obviously better later to improve. And finally, what we know from the review we did is that this community is often excluded from the early warning system. So it's really crucial to ensure that persons with disabilities have the full access to physical environments, transportation, communication, and all the services, including the early warning system, before the crisis, during the crisis, and finally, in post-disaster reconstruction. And also what is really important to have good health systems in place, which they, since they play really a crucial role. We know that there is a growing anxiety with climate crisis and everything. Now we have also a conflict in our region and so on. So it's really also crucial for all these efforts. Thank you so much. And yeah, 10 minutes. And I'm happy to answer any question that you may have.
Thank you, Milas. And that was a very nice illustration, I think, of the need to adapt not only the methods of delivery of education, but also the curricula that need to be covered. So that was very helpful. I don't know if there are any quick questions. Let's see. Again, please feel free to put things in the chat if not. And okay, so no reaction there. So thank you again, Milas. And we now move on to UNDP, where Iona, you will be talking about the perspective of UNDP. It's over to you, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. I'm very happy to be part of this group today. So my name is Ioana Creitaru. I am a disaster risk reduction specialist in UNDP's Crisis Bureau in Geneva. And today I will be covering a presentation that looks at UNDP's perspective on disability inclusion from a climate and disaster resilience point of view. My colleague Claudia will be showing the presentation and will be moving the slides. So I hope she's able to do that now.
Yeah, it's not giving me an option to share. It says only organizers and presenters can share. Is there a possibility to make me a presenter?
I'm just doing it now.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
It should work now.
Perfect. Yes.
And after the presentation, we will also be sharing the links that have been included. And I'm hoping, colleagues, that you can also share the presentation itself. I need to apologize. I'm not very inclusive in terms of this presentation because I cannot be on camera. My internet connection is not great here. So I'm hoping that you will be hearing me all right. And in case there's any issue, my colleague Claudia is happy to take on. So colleagues, I'm really grateful that my colleagues from OHCHR and UNDRR have been really nicely setting the stage for this presentation as they covered very critical issues around the importance of climate and disaster resilience and the way this impacts you know, the rights and the issues confronted by persons with disabilities. And obviously what has been said about the Sendai framework is also really great framing for this presentation. So I'm just going to jump very quickly to UNDP's work on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction and recovery for building resilience. This is a very new practice area for UNDP. Obviously, UNDP has been for a long time engaged in disability inclusion, but from a broader perspective of how development actions and the advancements of the SDGs can and should be taking into account issues around disability inclusion. So over the past few years, in fact, we have been more substantively engaged in coming up with an agenda for the organization that looks at disability inclusion and disaster risk reduction. On this slide here, you have a few resources that speak to UNDP's engagement in disability inclusion more broadly. And as I said, we will be sharing the links to these public documents. There are a couple of pieces of information here that are helping the framing of this presentation, which are focused on recent work that has unfolded over the past 2 years around taking stock of UNDP's programmatic footprint, if you allow this phrasing, around disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, recovery, and more broadly resilience building. So the review of state of disability inclusion within UNDP's programs that focus on climate and disaster resilience have led to the formulation of a policy brief that I will be speaking about in my next slide. This policy statement of UNDP has been co-created together with IDA, the International Disability Alliance. I think we can move on to the next slide, please. This policy brief really focuses on a very important element of our programmatic approach to disability inclusion, which is to promote a twin track approach. What UNDP means by saying that a twin track approach needs to be embedded in every program and policy statement that we develop is basically composed of 2 key elements. The first one is to mainstream disability inclusion in existing programs and approaches and initiatives. And the mainstreaming approach includes removing barriers to participation of persons with disabilities and facilitating access to information and services. On the other hand, the other element of this twin track approach concerns developing disability-specific initiatives, including those that promote capacity development of persons with disabilities themselves, or OPDs, as well as providing individualized support and services that specifically target persons with disabilities. So actually they are part and parcel of, decision-making and co-creating solutions that address the well-being that they have. So all of these twin track approach would ideally turn and contribute to ensuring equal rights and opportunities of all persons with disabilities in their full diversity. So let me just continue, if we can move to the next slide, to speak a little bit about our policy framing. And the reason why I really wanted to bring this forward, colleagues, today was that I'm hoping that some of these ideas here would be useful in the programs around education as well, and green schools, which are obviously the interest of the discussion as well. So UNDP's policy statement on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction and recovery for building resilience have been focused on a consultation with persons with disabilities, with UNDP program staff that are involved in disability inclusive programming, as well as our colleagues and partners from the International Disability Alliance. Through this policy brief, we're hoping to provide a snapshot of those important principles and good practices for disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction and recovery. Obviously, when we say disaster risk reduction, we also refer to those elements that pertain to climate-related disaster risk reduction as well. We are hoping that it will also promote within the organization inclusive approaches that recognize that and address the rights of persons with disabilities in all their diversity, not only as beneficiaries, which is mostly the case in many programs today, but actually as co-creators, as designers, and as partners in all of these initiatives that concern them. Let's move to our next slide to speak a little bit about the principles and the policy messages that we're drawing from UNDP. And actually, I'm hoping that some of these will also be useful and inspirational, hopefully, for your process as well. So we're looking at the policy messages around a rights-based approach that needs to, that is crucial for inclusive and equitable disaster risk reduction and recovery efforts and initiatives. As I said previously, we are proposing that a twin track approach for disability inclusion be included in all initiatives that UNDP takes part in or initiates. Another policy message is around the fact that meaningful participation and leadership of persons with disabilities in all their diversity is absolutely crucial for achieving effective disaster risk reduction at every stage. So as I said, treating persons with disabilities and OPDs not only as beneficiaries in projects, but actually co-developers and co-creators of solutions and initiatives as well is very important for UNDP. In terms of partnerships and supporting OPDs with capacity strengthening is equally a very important policy message. So making sure that OPDs and persons with disabilities themselves are partners within our initiatives. Ensuring that quality disaggregated data is instrumental in understanding disaster risk reduction and informing inclusive risk assessments and planning. And finally, ensuring that innovation, technology, and digital solutions contribute to enhancing accessibility and inclusions of persons with disabilities. Now, these have been a series of our, policy recommendations. As I said, I'm hoping these more normative approaches would be useful in the reflections that you are undertaking. To finalize my presentation, I also wanted to give you a couple of examples that are relevant for your initiative around education and green schools. The first one is a project of UNDP that focuses on tsunami preparedness for school children with disabilities. This project has been rolled out in Thailand, India, and Indonesia, and I'm obviously very happy to be sharing with you more information about these projects, including project documents, if these are useful in your initiative as well. We're also preparing actually a blog for UNDP where we will showcase some of the examples from this project. So this project focused on training students, teachers, and administrators in schools in 24 countries since 2019. We have focused on lessons from 3 countries here. In the countries that you have listed here, we have seen that the project has successfully supported the launch of a first ever inclusive national guidelines for tsunami evacuation plans and drills. And here on the slide, you also have a few examples of inclusive measures that have been promoted by the project. For instance, teachers having received training on developing inclusive emergency plans to effectively support students with disabilities. The project has also supported the setup of a buddy system where classmates assist students with disabilities, the development of inclusive information handouts, and so on. Let me also move on to our next example, which is not linked directly to education, but I thought it was a very sort of interesting project where we tackled climate resilience. So it's a project that really focuses on sustainable climate resilient farming in Ghana. And here what we have seen is actually the success of the program has translated into the development of a community managed fund that is used for different investments that are useful for the community, including education. So really here with this project example, we wanted to showcase that sometimes we have, community-driven initiatives that are deciding and designing the priorities for the community. And even if the project is not focused on education, it can have a positive impact on the way community addresses educational, priorities. So very briefly, this project has supported the setup of irrigation systems, including training for the community, addressing also persons with disabilities in the community so that they can actually participate to the farming activities that would in turn increase their resilience to climate and disaster risk. And obviously through these initiatives, through this project, we have seen an improvement of food security, income generation, and obviously empowering the individuals in the community. And as I said, a positive outcome has been the setup of this fund, where the community provides resources necessary for other priorities that go beyond the project. So with this, let me stop here, colleagues. I hope this has been useful for you. I would be very happy to provide more information. Obviously, UNDP, as the UN's developing agency, has many examples and many good practices that can be shared. Our colleagues on the ground are also supportive of disability inclusion. So any information that you might need, happy to support, and very honored to be here today with you. Let me hand over. In case there are any questions, I'm happy to respond to them now or in the chat. And I will be asking Claudia, my colleague, to drop the links now so you can have access to them. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Iona, and Claudia as well. I had a quick question. The brief you mentioned, did you say when that would be available, or where it will appear?
So it is currently under consultation at UNDP, and we're hoping to be able to launch it officially, to publish it in fall. So I'm looking at September as our target date, and we're hoping, actually it's really nice. Thank you for the question. We're also hoping to organize an event in Geneva on the occasions of the International Day of Persons with Disabilities on 3rd of December to actually talk about also this policy brief. So some of the colleagues here on the call might hear from me because we're trying to pull the UN community together around this topic as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I see that Claudia has dropped indeed all the links in the chat. And I saw also there was a fair bit of chat between Milos. I'm getting better. I'm trying to practice my pronunciation. And Therese as well. So thank you very much for that. And now we move on to the second half of the webinar, which is more about the green schools. And starting first with Sara Margano of UNESCO, from the UNESCO education sector. So Sara, over to you, please. Or Sarah.
Sarah,
thank you.
it's fine. Thank you very much for inviting me to intervene in this very interesting meeting. So I'm Sara Margano, a project officer in the Education for Sustainable Development section at UNESCO. And I am here to speak more generally on the global process that is happening at UNESCO related to green schools. So I'm going to share my screen. Please tell me if
it's all good.
If
Perfect.
it's good. Okay, thank you. So first of all, I would like to share a bit of context in which our work on Green School has been initiated, which is actually linked to the Greening Education Partnership, which has recently been launched and that you might have heard of. I will come back to this. So greening education, our work on greening education has been really a concept that is more embedded in UNESCO's work on education for sustainable development, for which we are the lead UN agency. And in this aspect, we focus particularly on the role of education in addressing climate change, to really highlight the key role of education to empower learners to become agents of change by equipping them with the knowledge, skills, and behaviors to build environmentally sustainable societies. And so as kind of the norm setting agency in education, we first we've been looking at the current status of greening education, and particularly on where we stand today on access to greening education. And the recent UNESCO studies that we undertook had quite a stark finding including that only half of national education policies and curricula mention climate change. We also undertook a teacher survey and collaboration with OECD, where we found out that 95% of primary and secondary teachers believe that teaching climate change is essential, but only 23% of teachers can explain well how to take action on climate change. And last year, actually, we released a publication right before COP26 in Sharm el-Sheikh called Youth Demand Quality Climate Change Education, where we undertook a study and we engaged with more than 17,000 youth through a global survey, but also through focus group discussions to ask young people about their experience, about their aspirations, and thoughts on the education they receive regarding climate change. And again, the finding is quite stark, where 70% of the youth surveyed said that they cannot explain climate change or can only explain its broad principle or do not know anything about it. And they've mainly highlighted in those discussions the fact that whenever they were exposed to climate change education, it was still very much done in a passive, traditional way through posters rather than hands-on activities and project-based learner-centered activities. So as a response to this, and in parallel with what we are all seeing as a growing momentum when it comes to political will and the attention put on education as one of the key tools to tackle the climate crisis, the Greening Education Partnership was launched as a key outcome of the Transforming Education Summit in 2022 in New York. So you might have heard that the Youth Declaration at the UN Transforming Education Summit called upon decision makers to invest in education for sustainable development across curricula, particularly climate education, to build skills and knowledge needed for climate justice. And this declaration was really a culmination of a long process of consultations, which reflected the contributions of a million young people. And so really the Greening Education Partnership is a global initiative that takes a whole school, whole system approach to support countries to tackle the climate crisis by harnessing the critical role of education. So concretely, it's a collaborative platform for government and key stakeholders, organizations working on education and climate change to come together to deliver a strong, coordinated and comprehensive action on climate change education to have collective accountability. And this platform is to really focus work on 4 action areas: greening schools, greening curriculum, greening teacher training and education systems capacities, and greening communities. And the partnership has grown quite tremendously, as it was only launched, as I said, in September 2022. And as of now, we have more than 70 member states and more than 700 organizations that have joined. And it is interesting to hear from the countries that have joined that 76% of them plan to update curriculum to include climate change and ESD in the next 3 years. 87% plan to update teacher training to include climate change and ESD in the next 3 years. And over 80% of these countries are interested in more than the 3 pillars that I've presented when they chose to join. So it is really a momentum that we're trying to capitalize on to really accelerate action on climate change education. And particularly as part of this Greening Education Partnership, for our conversation, the pillar 1 on greening school is the most relevant one, where we have more than 385 organizations that are part of these groups. Actually, the focal points of these groups are the Foundation for Environmental Education, Aga Khan Foundation, and WFP. And it is really to collaboratively work together to understand how can concepts of greening schools be implemented to ensure a whole institution approach, including greening teaching and learning, climate-ready school facilities and operations, inclusive governance, and community engagement. And looking at these 4 aspects under greening school, which really encompass the whole school approach, this is actually where the relevance of disaster risk reduction and disability inclusion is key, particularly in the school facilities and operation, as well as the school engagement with communities. So the work that we hope to understand, to undertake collectively in this working group is to work together with all the different organizations in their diverse fields of expertise to first understand what everybody is doing, because there's actually great work being undertaken by all of us. So it's not a question of UNESCO wanting to reinvent the wheel, and actually UNESCO is merely a convener and acts as the secretariat of the Greening Education Partnership. But it's really to provide accountability and leaderships and visibility for everybody's work, every organization working in this field, but also sort of creating this cohesive, almost matchmaking exercise where countries joining the Greening Education Partnership could highlight their needs and could be aware of organizations in their regional context working on these problematics to support them. And as part of one key output of this Greening School Pillar 1 is actually the Green School Quality Standard. So UNESCO, who acts as a secretariat of the Greening Education Partnership, is also directly contributing to the partnership by working on 2 projects, mainly at the moment. So it's the development of green curriculum guideline, as well as the development of a UNESCO global standard on green school, global quality standard on green school. And the idea is to really encourage schools to holistically integrate a whole school approach to ESD within their systems by working with school accreditation schemes to transform school holistically. So again, we're talking about the 4 aspects of the whole school approach: teaching and learning, school facilities and operation, school governance, and community engagement, with a particular emphasis on schools' climate readiness. So this very important process that we are initiating, we are actually conceiving it in a co-creative perspective, as the draft quality standard is really to provide a concrete translation of key principles at the school level. And it will be an iterative process, as it will include consultations with the working group 1 of the Greening Education Partnership, which, as I've said, gathers more than 385 members, including UNDP, WFP, also the GADRES coalition, who will very much highlight the perspective on disaster risk reduction. And we will also undertake 8 pilot countries to test the standard on 2 dimensions, test the standards with policymakers to really understand if for them this UNESCO global quality standard is relevant, and what are the gaps and opportunities for them in ministries of education specifically and technical staff to adopt or adapt, but also at school level to really test how practical this concrete instrument is supposed to be. So the aim is to release this standard in summer 2024. And just to really maybe link it more with the context of Turkmenistan, but more generally, concretely with different countries who are all embarking in this journey of greening their education and embedding sustainability in their education systems. The idea is to really provide these tools to countries with this green school quality standard, accompanied with a list of accreditation schemes that exist in our countries with whom we would have worked, because a lot of them are actually part of the Greening Education Partnership, who would have aligned with this global quality standard. So that
sorry, Sarah, yeah. Can I have to interrupt you. Could you maybe wrap up, please? Thank you.
Yes, and that's just to finish on this, that we're very much hoping to be working through our field offices with countries so that they can adopt or adapt as they wish this green school quality standard in collaboration with the accreditation schemes that we would have worked with globally. Thank you very much, and sorry for the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we will move on to our final speaker, my colleague Angela from UNECE, who works in our Environmental Performance Review program. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you. I've tried to share my presentation.
Yes, it is shared.
You see it?
Yes, but you need to make it.
I made it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I work in a program of environmental performance reviews, which since its inception always looked into environmental education in countries, and since some over 10 years looks into education for sustainable development. Developments in countries, also because UNICEF has a regional strategy on education for sustainable development, and Turkmenistan is part of that strategy, although it doesn't participate very actively in the activities under the strategy. So in short, I will call them EPRs. We usually look, we have a separate chapter most often. Sometimes it's integrated into other chapters like public participation or environmental information, We look into the countries' activities to integrate education for sustainable development into formal, non-formal, and informal education at all levels. Also into teachers training, initial and in service, into civil servants, in service training, into research and development. We also look at how countries integrate sustainable development themes and ESD as an approach into legal, policy, and institutional frameworks in their countries, how they operationalize ESD, whether they allocate enough financial support, whether they have projects ongoing, whether they launch initiatives and promote broadly ESD. We also review recommendations made in previous CPRs related to environmental education and ESD as relevant. And we look at progress since 2017. We also look at progress achieved in meeting targets 4.7, 12.8, and 13.3 that are all related to education for sustainable development. Also in regards to promoting climate change and sustainable consumption and production into the school curricula and into non-formal and informal education. So we have, as part of our program, we have a country review mission, which is usually some 11 days in the country. We meet with education authorities, we meet with environment authorities, we meet with academia, visit universities, meet with NGOs and other civil society organizations that are working in education area. We also visit schools and kindergartens to see, and we meet usually the principals and some teachers to discuss how they put in practice ESD. And as a result, we write a chapter, which is some 20 pages. We provide recommendation to governments that governments commit to implementing within the next 5 to 10 years. So Turkmenistan had only carried out one environmental performance review back in 2012, so it's more than 10 years. Environmental education and ESD was addressed in a chapter together with environmental monitoring information and public participation. At that time, the conclusion was that the country does not include ESD in the formal curriculum at the preschool, primary school, and secondary school levels. However, the country was including, back in 2012, it was a mandatory general course on ecology taught at all higher education institutions. All universities and institutes in the country were obliged to teach the subject of ecology. And we had also a recommendation made back in 2012 to the government of Turkmenistan to, of course, fulfill its commitments under the UNECE strategy on ESD. And why do we do at UNECE? Why do we work on ESD at UNECE? It's exactly because in partnership with UNESCO, our colleagues in Paris, UNESCO does not have an office, a regional office for Europe. So back in 2003, when we started this work together with UNESCO, that was the agreement that here in this region, it would be UNECE to pursue this subject. But of course, we work very closely with UNESCO on promoting ESD. So here you see the recommendations. Now, I will not, in my presentation, I will only focus on green schools in the narrow term of this, in the narrow meaning of this term, because I can't possibly cover the ESD, also the curricula and the content and everything. So green schools or eco schools in some countries, we, based on the EPRs done in over 10, I think since 2018, we look more closely into this, so over 10 countries. It's considered as an efficient approach to operationalizing and promoting ESD. We have, depending on the countries, we have a big variety of models. We have green schools in some countries. In some countries, they establish green network of schools. Many countries, I would say almost half of the countries, they are part of this Eco School Global program, which is quite, it has a wide network global-wise, and they have the possibility also to share experience. And but they, of course, they are obliged to fulfill the criteria and requirements set by this global program. We have in some countries, they opt for governmental programs that are properly developed and adopted at the government level, and then they're implementing. In some countries, these are pushed by the civil society programs. Usually, if the countries are part of the Global Eco School program, then the national operator is a local and national NGO or other civil society. It can be a foundation, for instance. Then usually they start with few schools. It's never possible to start with many schools because it's also resource intensive, and it also has to be adapted not only to the needs of the country, but also to the needs of the local, because some countries, they are so vast that every local eco school has its own particularities. So usually they start piloting with 5 schools and then expand and replicate. Of course, as I mentioned, legal policy and institutional framework is very important. If you develop a program at the governmental level, it is usually developed through a multi-stakeholder participation. They establish some kind of working groups, task force that have participants from the ministries of environment and of education, from local authorities. They invite also some school representatives. They also invite a representative of civil society organizations, academia, to participate in the development of such a program. And then, of course, you have to establish an institutional framework of how to implement the program, operationalize it, then, of course, monitor and so on. And at school level, when they are part of this green school or eco schools, then of course not only students, but also not only teachers and students, but also parents and the communities are involved in the activities around the eco schools. So some example of elements. This is there is no one country that has all of them, but many of them, they are present. Usually each school, part of green school or eco school, they develop their own annual school program plan that includes both curricula and extracurricular activities. And majority of green school activities or eco school, they take place as part of extracurricular activities. Many schools have an eco codex. They also have developed their own eco anthem. They have an eco club, established eco club, and usually, I mean, it's voluntary participation, but every class usually delegates like 2 people to participate in these eco clubs, and it's them who take the lead of different eco activities taking place in the school. They also establish an eco patrol. They take the lead to organize, together with, of course, the teachers. Usually it's teacher of biology or geography, organize different celebration of environmental days and international events on environment and climate change. It's part of being a green school to classify as green school is the school is obliged to green its infrastructure, water facilities, energy facilities, and waste recycling. Many schools have started looking into installing solar panels. Of course, these are expensive, so for this they are trying to also have like mini projects developed in order to enable all these different waste, for instance, composting waste, little machines and so on. Also, as part of green schools, you have to have a green yard. And for some schools, it's very difficult because they are located in the middle of the capital, in the middle of concrete. So in this case, they have some partnership with local parks, with local authorities. They use parks or gardens to have this practical, bring children for practical activities. Some schools, they more and more we can see that they really try to fundraise and have a greenhouse, either if possible in the schoolyard or on school premises. If it's not possible, then they also do kind of green, they designate some space and they have this different growing plants based on different methodologies, without soil, with water and so on. There are some countries that have established experimental educational facilities that are developing their own environmental education programs, and they're testing in those facilities. And in one country, I was impressed that they are trying to organize majority of environmental education and ESD based on project learning. So they give, of course, some theory, but everything else students are doing in groups on project-based learning. Of course, many countries established eco criteria, eco education indicators that are monitored by the education inspectors. They have eco scorecards where they have different waste, energy, water, where they're scoring the schools. They are monitoring and reporting on progress. And you have to, these countries, they also have awards and recognitions. For instance, those participating in eco schools, they aim to reach a green flag. Then here are some pictures that I just pulled together from different EPRs with eco codex and some manuals on how to recycle waste. And it's very important in all this greening of the yard and greening activities, is very important to involve students. Then, okay, the developing capacities, it's very important. Everyone knows that you need to develop the materials and train. Also, it's important to train the school directors. Usually they undergo separate training than the school teachers, because they also are trained to create from the school, to use the whole school approach to their school, to their schools. So these are two separate trainings. They also eco school members undergo training, and many countries establish networks so that people can exchange experience and communicate. Financial support, of course, is crucial. Everyone complains that they would like to expand all these activities, but the bottleneck is financial support. And that's why they start small with few schools and then try to replicate. And in one country, they establish with local authorities from some opportunities for small grants, even maybe like per year, $500 already helps them to buy seedlings, to be able to plant trees and to maybe do other activities. Also, various partnerships established with the local businesses. For instance, in one country, schools have partnerships with local waste collecting authorities, where they, at school, even from home, they bring different wastes and they collect them separately: paper, aluminium, e-waste, electronic waste. And then these companies, they come regularly to school and pick up all this collected waste and instead give the school, for instance, a printer, paper, A4 paper, and so on, and other help otherwise the schools. And this is, I think, my last slide. It's one example from Azerbaijan. It's they relatively recently, in 2015, they developed a green network of schools program together with the two ministries in charge of the environment and education. They designated the Republican Children and Youth Development Center as implementing partner. And then an annual plan of activities for the entire country is developed by this center in cooperation with the two ministries. They organize annual environmental forum in person and during COVID online. They have some pilot schools across the entire country, and then they replicate this practice, and every year it grows, the network. They have established a network of eco clubs. Eco clubs is very important to maintain the green schools. And then they even developed the basics of ecology educational program for Eco Club members, which is 13 one-month module, including climate change module. And they teach it over the 1-2 year. And this is like extra curricula, separate, those that are members of the Eco Club. And of course, they do train the school teachers and directors, and they monitor progress report awards during this annual environmental forum. Then they designate those schools that are doing better, and they award them different type of recognition. And I am done, and all the environmental performance reviews are on our website, and it depends on the interest of Turkmenistan. Then of course, even the Turkmenistan, the only EPR is also on our website, but the section on the education is very, very small. But you can check other EPRs where you have bigger assessment of ESD, and then see which are the most relevant experience, and then we can maybe facilitate also communication with those countries. Thank you very much. Sorry for taking the time.
Thank you, Angela. And just to say that we think that Turkmenistan will ask for another environmental performance review quite soon. I don't know if there are any questions. I realize we have gone over time slightly. And if there aren't any questions, maybe Adrian, would you like to say any final words?
Hi, hello everybody.
Yes.
Hope you can hear me. Yes, I seem to have a problem with the
Yes.
microphone. This has been a very, very interesting presentation, and thank you again for hosting it. It's covered a wide range of issues, and it goes from the international to the global, and also brings a spotlight onto Turkmenistan. I was particularly interested to see some of the examples in other countries on how these are being promoted, and also the wider framework, especially through UNESCO. We are partnering with UNESCO on the green schools and on education in Turkmenistan. And I think it's very important that from a UN country team, we have a joint approach on this, not just on UN agencies specifically in their corner, but as a wider UN approach. This is absolutely critical, especially for the focus on Turkmenistan and the joint messaging we're giving. It's not good to have different agencies all championing the green schools when actually the school is the focal point. It's also important to see how a lot of these frameworks, a lot of these policies and advice and guidance, how it's materialized down to the community level. One of the issues we struggle with in Turkmenistan is that because it's a high middle income country, a lot of our work is focused on upstream. So we deal with policies and governments, and one of the challenges we have is how to articulate real substantive change at community level. Down at community level, in many countries, access to communities is relatively easy. It's an operating environment where we have missions to field. Here, because it's so upstream work, going down to areas where we deal with communities, dealing with children, dealing with where you can actually touch the brick and mortar and deal with the teachers and community people at local level is absolutely critical, because that is where the change is going to start. That is where the change is going to start. Turkmenistan is a country that has a lot of investment in technology. They are very modern. You see it in Arkadak, a city that is going to be opened and launched very soon. So in terms of financing, in terms of high-tech technology, in terms of vision, in terms of interest and engagement, it's there. It's there. The problem is translating it down to the community level. And this project in particular, out of many that I've seen, solarization, green schooling, curriculum change is where the change is going to happen, because this is we're almost in an emergency in terms of climate change adaptation and dealing with environmental issues. But at the same time, it's also a marathon. It's a long-term goal that we need to persistently strive. So the joint UN approach is absolutely critical, and we are fully behind that. So just reach out to yourselves for convening all the UN agencies that are here today, and to UNESCO, particularly because they're partnering with us on the Green Schools in Turkmenistan. And we look forward to meeting up again and to seeing how we progress. So let's track the change and see how we take it from here. Thank you very much, everybody.
And thank you, and a very big thank you to our speakers today. And the video will be posted on the website of Issue-Based Coalition within the week. It will go on YouTube, in fact. So we expect that it will get quite a bit of viewing then. So thank you very much for your time and for sharing all of your expertise. And it's really good to be working together. So thank you and goodbye.